I
Sure.
started working in digital marketing in the late 90s. So it was kind of click-through rates were very hot. And then it was the emergence of like, oh, we can measure conversions and see what people are doing on the website. And then endless debates about view-through conversions. And, I think that there was this, can we just make measurement work? And I mean, in the late 90s, we were looking at media mix modeling coming from offline media and thinking to ourselves, like, oh, so approximate. Like, can you imagine being in that situation where you didn't know what was going on? Fast forward 30 years and now digital like looks very similar where we don't have great reliable measurement across a lot of different channels. Your description of the saying we don't want to move the phone number because that's not how we're incentivized reminds me of the late aughts. So I was part of Avenue A and then a Quantive. And so Rick and I met as arch competitors across the double click a Quantive divide, and now proving that people can come together. But we were out meeting with people trying to sell multi-touch attribution, in 2006, 2007, meeting with teams where I realized as we get to the end of the meeting, like, oh, everything that feeds into their bonus is being jeopardized by what I'm proposing in this meeting. This is never going to happen.
You are listening to Power Marketing with Kevin Lee. Kevin and his agency Did It have helped thousands of businesses win through superior marketing, as have his books, articles, speaking engagements, and the E-Marketing Association Power Marketing Podcasts. Here's Kevin.
Hi, I'm Kevin Lee with the E-Marketing Association. I also run Did It, a digital marketing agency that started as a SEO SaaS platform in 1996 and went through many, many pivots. Now we're managing a whole lot of paid media of every kind, including mailing over 30 million pieces of direct mail a year with custom QR codes and such. So it's always been an area of fascination for me to try to uncover the upside for clients. And there's ways that agencies do that, and there's ways that researchers do it even better in some cases. So I'm super excited to have Rick Bruner of Central Control and Professor John Chandler, who assists in Central Control and also runs Data Insights, to chat about marketing research as it relates to marketing optimization. So let's start with, how much upside do you think that there is in the sort of largest enterprise media and marketing campaigns that is just unrealized as a result of not doing the experimentation and the research to uncover that opportunity?
Great. Well, I'll jump in on that. Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me, Kevin, and welcome to your guests. Yeah, I believe that there is really kind of a misplaced prioritization in the marketing community on waste in the budget. There certainly is a lot of waste, and there's a lot of waste that can be optimized. But really, the greatest opportunity for optimization is, as you say, the upside, the unrealized sales that you're not achieving because you're not adequately investing in the parts of the mix that have the biggest impact by being misdirected by poor measurement or not enough or no measurement at all in some cases. There's a case study in our work of a Fortune 100 company we worked with, who is one of the biggest advertiser spenders in America, who was spending $100 million a year on branded search at the time that they had us measure that. And we did a randomized controlled trial and geographic randomization of all the DMAs in the country. Some were in test and some were holdout controls. And then they looked at sales from their CRM data, not looking just at pixel conversions. And what they found was there was no impact effectively on their online sales channel, which is for 17 years where they focused all their attention trying to observe through Google pixel conversions what the effect was on online sales. But their much bigger sales channel, about 80% of their sales, go through the telephone. And lo and behold, the telephone number comes up on the results page, on the first Google results page. And whether that ad was above the fold or not had a psychological effect to the order of 3% of all transactions. And this was a $55 billion company at the time. And that's $1.5 billion of sales that was being jeopardized in an effort to save 50 million in sales. So really, the opportunity was not at all to save waste. It was to recognize the tremendous impact that the channel was having. So it's hard to put an upper bound on it, but it's definitely double digits for sure. And it's really where your growth is. You're not going to grow by cutting your budget. You're going to grow by investing in the right things.
That's a great point, John. Any thoughts on how big of a missed opportunity these mega spenders and mid-sized spenders as well are missing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Rick's exactly right that, and thanks for having us. It's really an honor to be on your pod. I think Rick's exactly right that there's always going to be waste, and we can use experimentation and better analysis to figure out kind of where we can reallocate resources. But finding this upside and ROI on either new opportunities or preserving opportunities that are working really well, easily in the, 25, 50% return on investment. And we've worked on cases that is much higher than that, as Rick is talking about. So it can be, an experiment like that where we're catching a person going from an online experience into a real life experience on the phone with a multi-channel advertiser. It's a big lift, but the upside is really tremendous too.
Yeah, that's great to hear for everybody in the research business. I hope enough folks hear the message to go out there and invest in the research. Oddly enough, over the years, I had one very, very large client, similarly sized to what Rick described, who we were doing conversion rate optimization on, and we suggested that they move their phone number to be more prominent on the landing page. And the team that we spoke to said, well, we're the online division. We don't get credit for those sales, so we don't want to do that. We're going to force them to dig around to the contact us page. Of course, I just shook my head and sort of tried to decide whether or not to call their CMO or CEO to describe the conversation. But that was a while back. I do believe they've now more prominently moved to omni-channel optimization. So let's pivot a little bit into sort of the evolution of marketing measurement. Back when I learned about it pre even McCann Erickson or J. Walter Thompson from my statistics professor, we were taught fractional factorial design and media mix modeling as sort of the standard in 1991. That's evolved a lot. So I'd love to hear, how easy or difficult it is now. It used to be that you had to have a pretty gigantic budget to get statistical relevance, especially if you're going to do a fractional factorial design. And so, and that made research out of reach for a lot of advertisers and marketers. So I'd love to hear how it's evolved both at the big marketer side, but also for the mid to smaller marketers, so that what they can do to take advantage of the benefits of running research.
Yeah, and maybe Rick, I'll start and you can chime in. I
Sure.
started working in digital marketing in the late 90s, so it was kind of click-through rates were very hot, and then it was the emergence of like, oh, we can measure conversions and see what people are doing on the website, and then endless debates about view-through conversions, and I think that there was this, can we just make measurement work? And in the late 90s, we were looking at media mix modeling coming from offline media and thinking to ourselves, like, oh, so approximate. Like, can you imagine being in that situation where you didn't know what was going on? Fast forward 30 years, and now digital like looks very similar, where we don't have great reliable measurement across a lot of different channels. Your description of the say we don't want to move the phone number because that's not how we're incentivized reminds me of the late aughts. So I was part of Avenue A and then a Quantive. And so Rick and I met as arch competitors across the double-click a quantive divide, and now proving that people can come together. But we were out meeting with people trying to sell multi-touch attribution, in 2006, 2007, meeting with teams where I realized as we'd get to the end of the meeting, like, oh, everything that feeds into their bonus is being jeopardized by what I'm proposing in this meeting. This is never going to happen. We were a few years too early on that. And then I think there was this brief kind of halcyon days for multi-touch attribution where the idea was, oh, we're going to successfully measure one-to-one marketing across every channel. We'll approximate TV and print and things like that, but everything in digital, we're going to have one data warehouse, data management platforms were kind of exploding. And I mean, Rick, how long did that last? Like 30 minutes, 45 minutes when we thought we'd really be able to pull it off?
I don't know that I was ever as sure as you were from that description. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I want to come back to your point, Kevin, about like the conflicting incentives. And, John made a similar point about, whether, people are really going to believe and implement the numbers. But John also mentioned one-to-one marketing. I think that was one of the greatest disservices, that metaphor in the history of digital marketing. The idea, you were never really marketing to that girl in seventh grade math class, that, hey, now remember you used to like make faces at me when I asked you to pass my notes to my friend, and I'm in digital marketing now. Give me a call. That's not what one-to-one marketing, that sounds like what the promise would be, but we've always priced it in CPMs. Well, I correct myself. There's also cost per click, but it's always about massive reach. And I think, it's been two steps forward and one step sideways and one step back the whole way, that we're still putting together experiments and MMM, which you learned in stats class however many years ago. And to more directly address your question about like large advertisers and small advertisers, multifactorial design is challenged now by the fact that the one-to-one marketing and the user level experiments have really deteriorated since privacy initiatives and Apple's ad tracking, blocking software have dealt a real blow to that. And while you can still track a certain percentage of the audience that's exposed, and there's a whole infrastructure around user graphs and clean rooms to try to bridge those gaps, you're not able to match anywhere near 100%. I mean, you're lucky if you can match 50% of the audience that got exposed to the audience that converted. And then there are systemic differences between those that are trackable and those that are not trackable. So you can't really generalize that to the whole campaign. There's a ton of, technical overhead and cost to doing it that way. And so in our practice, we've gravitated more to geographic experiments, but large-scale geographic experiments. I don't want to get lost in a methodological conversation, is my want to do, but not match market tests, but taking like all the DMAs in the United States and putting them all randomizing them into testing control groups. But there, for smaller advertisers, there are, for quite small advertisers, mom and pop shops, really, if you're not advertising on Facebook and then you start advertising on Facebook and you see a big jump in sales, you probably don't need to do sophisticated experiments, because that's probably incremental already. Like if nobody had heard of your brand and now a portion of the audience is seeing your ad and clicking or not clicking, but sales jump, you can do what's called an interrupted time series, or what I call a Dilbert test. Turn it off and turn it back on again and see if anything happens. There are some kind of cruder mechanisms to test things. There's also a field that's always been around in digital measurement, but has grown in some nuanced ways, of quasi experiments. that aren't really quite randomized experiments, but they're, you know, they aim to be high quality causal inference. A popular method these days is synthetic controls. The rule of thumb with quasi-experiments is to use them where you can't do randomized experiments. And for large advertisers, if the will is there, which is a big if, you generally can do randomized experiments. But for advertisers or media channels where that's not possible, that's something net new in the practice in the last 5 to 10 years, like these synthetic controls. They're basically like match market tests of yesteryear, where you take St. Louis and Philadelphia and say St. Louis looks enough like Philadelphia that we're going to say this is the test and this is the control, and see if sales go up. Of course,
Kevin is going to get so many angry emails from Philadelphians about this.
Yeah, I maybe should think harder about my examples when I cite that. But there are all sorts of other things like sporting event, sporting culture, speaking of Philadelphia, and weather and supply chains and competitive mixes and other things that could explain those differences. So synthetic controls are like match market test on statistical steroids. You just put more markers into the control and weight them to look more like the test. And then, of course, there's AI, which, let me just put a pin in that and we can follow that up. But there are some new developments, but we're still trying to get the basics right, honestly, after all these years.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like the opportunity to simply just go in and find low-hanging fruit is, for a lot of marketers, is probably worth investigating, right? And then sort of moving up from there, further up the tree to identify additional opportunities as a result of running the proper research. One of the things we found at Did It, having started in search engine marketing, and then as a result of 11 acquisitions, sort of moved into the mid and upper funnel, is we found that the strongest brands get sort of a discount in all the auction media, right? So their quality score in paid search is higher, their click-through rate on Meta or programmatic is higher, and so there's this halo effect that happens as a result of, I guess you'd call it upper funnel or branding and awareness advertising, and that can also include earned media. But there's a very pronounced halo effect from that. And I would imagine that it's harder because of the lag in brand lift and brand awareness to run the kind of tests, right, that are easier if you're just looking at the demand harvesting media and the demand harvesting KPIs. You can sort of pretty easily arrive at a lift number, but as you're starting to really try to understand the impact of the ad channels and the ad creative that are more about branding and awareness, you still want to be able to understand the impact of those, but you have to construct potentially a very different kind of experiment, or maybe a longer term experiment. So I'd love to hear when you guys meet with clients and you sort of try to advise them on finding opportunities and finding the impact of the channels, and media mix within channels and across channels. And of course, the creative has a huge impact, right? Getting the creative right within your channel is super important. So from an expectation setting perspective, when you talk to people through and say, well, we can probably identify lift for the demand harvesting and lower funnel channels in X amount of time, but we don't want to ignore upper funnel impact, because you get this brand discount in the lower funnel when you optimize upper funnels. So I know that was a mouthful, but I'd love to get your thoughts on that, because it's a conversation that in particular, our more enterprise level clients have with us all the time, because they want to understand that.
Well, I can take that first. So I am, a big believer, and have seen the evidence to support it, that the idea that, brand advertising is harder to measure performance is not really correct. That, brand delivers performance as well. It creates those longer lag effects, that can last for years and decades. I mean, I can still sing the Oscar Mayer baloney jingle, but I'll spare you. But it's showing up in the nearer term, even in the lower funnel media that you're talking about. And altogether, the effect of advertising on sales is probably smaller than a lot of people think. If you're, especially for large advertisers that have, a lot of brand equity, so they've already, and they have distribution, they're on the shelves, people have bought them in the past, people know them from years of advertising. If you take all the advertising away today, they're still going to sell for a while. There's a baseline of sales, built in that has nothing to do with today's advertising. And then they've got a lot of different ad channels. And so let's say there's 50%, and it may be more than that. That's the baseline. It may be 70% or something. But let's say 50% is that baseline, and then the other 50% is divided across 20 different media channels. So what is that? 2.5%, if does my math right, that is available on average to each of those channels to have an effect on sales. And so, typically we see ad lift on overall general sales from 0 to 5% or something. We try to power experiments for 2 or 3%, and that is measurable with the kind of technique I was talking about before, randomized geotests. And you can run those. One thing about DMAs is that almost all media can address to DMAs. In television, national TV buys, when you buy direct from ABC or cable networks, they typically just sell nationally, but you can go to Ampersand or Sinclair or Nexstar, some other networks that can either networks of local station groups or just cable that is targetable by DMA, like through Ampersand, where you can do our method of turning on and turning off. So it is measurable. And there may be, typically we can do our tests in about 6 weeks or shorter. And more sales volume makes it easier. If you're selling hundreds of thousands or millions of units per month, that makes the measurement easier.
Yeah. And
John.
one set of dots to connect here is that, putting all of this into like a research framework, really, and whether you're a relatively small advertiser with kind of more modest budgets or one of these kind of behemoths, we now have, particularly I think through data science development with AI, gotten to this place where any marketer can have a media mix model that would have been well beyond the state of the art 20 years ago. Right, with some of the open source models that are out there, I know a number of smaller firms, that are helping people. I mean, we do this kind of work as well. And so creating a framework where you've got a media mix model that can do things that was never possible 40, 50 years ago, where we're, doing very fine time slices, geographic areas, and then also taking into account ad stock and a little bit of the interaction between channels, and then spinning up experiments and trying to find this sweet spot where we're not jeopardizing very much revenue, but we're creating an opportunity to learn about the impact of a given channel or pair of channels, and then that feeding in naturally to that kind of Bayesian media mix model and quasi experiments that don't return much signal, and successful experiments, as we would say, that do give us a very clear signal. All of those can be inputs into the priors on your Bayesian model, and create this really nice ability to measure results at a much more fine-grained level of resolution than we've ever been able to do before. So I feel like I always say this, it's like an interesting and fascinating time to be in advertising measurement because it's such a hard problem. And our technology and ability to measure seems to keep pace with the proliferation of channels and data difficulties in this way, where we're always like riding the wave of like, okay, what can we say? I mean, it's kind of applied epistemology.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was sort of considered the sort of poor man's test for lower budget advertisers was to look at the leading indicators which show up sooner, right? When we do a
Mhm.
geographic split test to look for surge in direct navigation and surge in brand keyword search query volume. And to some extent, I think that's still a valid way of sort of looking at the leading indicators, which hopefully those do turn into lift in sales or registration or whatever your or and profit, revenue and profitability. I think probably one of the things that's been a bit of a monkey wrench into that is now there may be an in-between layer of for certain audiences is they're starting to use AI, right, to chatbot themselves into their researching of something, and it's harder for us to get a handle on some of the zero-click behavior that comes out of AI. So we'll use that as a segue into how do changing consumer behaviors change how you guys structure your research?
Yeah, well, yeah, AI is a tricky one. I mean, we really, our main focus is paid media, and paid media still in not all media channels can you target in ways that support experiments. I mentioned that geo is a preferred method and that DMAs are targetable in most media, but not all media. Retail media, which is another area that's gone through a lot of boom, a new customer behavior, enabled by the industry of running ads in the shopping e-commerce sites. They Amazon and Walmart, for example, don't yet allow targeting within the search results of paid media on their sites, which is where most of the spending goes, and it's what advertisers are most interested in. So, there you get into more kind of quasi-experimental methods, pre and post, the turning it on, turning it off, like I mentioned. And the effect of AI chatbots on navigation is quite emerging, and advertising is emerging in those channels, but it's not really a mature advertising channel yet. You're describing more like organic, behavior, and that is definitely harder to run an experiment on. I don't know, John, do you have any thoughts? Have you encountered that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this, like all AI answers, the default answer is things are changing so fast. Let's just have this conversation for 20 minutes and we can have a different answer at the end of that conversation. But, I think that these sort of, I mean, this is something we've seen, I mean, we've all been in this industry for decades. We have seen changing consumer behaviors, the way people get around the web. I mean, like the rise of broadband at one point, then mobile experiences and cross-device measurement. And, these aspects of the business mature and follow the money, right? And so product listing ads, 10, 15 years ago, people weren't really talking about Amazon's emergence as a recipient of advertising dollars has changed dramatically in the last 5, 10 years. And I think we're going to see that exact same change with the AI platforms, right? The shakedown for advertiser money has not really started yet, but in a couple years, you can imagine that OpenAI is going to be a pretty large line item on a lot of advertisers' budgets. And so then once that maturity happens, we are now back into the world of, okay, we can experiment on it because we have money that we can control at the front end that changes the behavior of that channel. And then we can measure money on the back end, right? And like ultimately, this all ties back to real business decisions, regardless of the complexity in the middle. But as it stands right now, it's like another place where I feel like advertisers who are on the cutting edge of that must just be tearing their hair out because it's so complicated and changing so fast.
Yeah, and right now, I guess we'd treat it as an exogenous factor like the weather. I mean, there's not much, that marketers are doing to influence it. Increasingly, what are they calling AEO, or AI engine optimization, or GEO, I think I've heard. Um, uh, Generative. Yeah, I was trying to remember what the G stands for. Um, but yeah, I mean, I guess you could kind of look at the effect that your efforts in those kind of optimizations have from a before and after standpoint. But um, yeah, right now it's just kind of happening in the background environmentally, as it were.
Well, certainly GEO is the hottest category for the Did It team at the moment, and the area where we have the most proposals out and get the most requests for proposal. Because for the fact that I've been doing SEO longer than Google exists, I guess gives me some street cred in the category, and we've learned the LLM algorithm sufficiently well to understand the inputs and how they probabilistically change the outputs. Interestingly, almost all the inputs are earned media of different types, right? So it
Mhm.
it's important, like SEO was, and SEO also had a lot of earned media and owned media inputs as well. But let's finish off with a question. For folks who've listened this long, right? They're probably doing the math in their head, right? They're looking at their paid media spend, which is where these kind of experiments can yield the biggest fruit. And they're probably calculating, okay, maybe I've got 5% upside, maybe I've got 10, maybe I've got 15. I need to decide whether or not to either call a professional researcher and do research to uncover this opportunity, or to tell my agency to do it, right? Because I'm not confident my agency, who I've had in the case that you referenced, Rick, for 17 years, never bothered to do it, right? And so maybe they want to still have the agency be the manager of a professional researcher. So they're doing this kind of math and deciding, okay, I spend 500,000 a year, a million a year, 5 million a year in paid media, and I do want the upside. So how much should they expect to pay for professional help, right? If they choose to use professional help.
Yeah. Well, I'll lay my biases on the table. We do this as our business, so we would recommend you employ experts or hire them. Hire experts internally. Large, that is people with causal measurement and experimental design expertise are kind of a hot commodity in the hiring market these days. And a lot of companies are in-housing that expertise. But consider that your agency, if they get rewarded on a share of spend, they've got a dog in the race. Do they really want to find that you should cut the budget anywhere? And internally, we talked earlier about kind of the conflicting incentives. You're a great example of the online department not wanting to feature the phone number because it was a competing department. Similarly, within the CMO's organization, the search engine team isn't eager to have their budget cut if it turns out that, not saying it's the case, Kevin, but if it turns out that there's, any room to be cut in search budget. Um, and there's a big difference between a well-constructed causal mechanism and a weakly constructed causal mechanism. And so, yeah, John, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I just, I think back to so many marketers that I've worked with who are, just sort of scared before experimentation happens, right? And people, we kind of don't know, we all have opinions about how marketing is working. We have stories we're telling ourselves, and we're very nervous that those stories might be wrong and that we're going to do an experiment and we're going to look stupid. A friend of mine has this line, it's hard to learn something without looking stupid. And I think there's some truth to that, right? Like we need to rely on our sort of marketing and ethical principles to wade in and start measuring. And I think that regardless of price point, whether somebody has a huge budget and they're carving off a couple percent for research where we can do some big experiments that may be overlapping and feed into these more sophisticated media mix models, or something in-house and people just want to dip a toe in the water. A former colleague of mine used to say, what's your alternative to an experiment? Are you going to flip your strategy coin and then make decisions? And so just kind of getting some instrumentation. And I agree with Rick that a better experiment is obviously going to yield better insights, more confidence going forward, higher quality data. But start somewhere and be open to what you're going to find, and know that if you are really cost constrained, you may end up with an experiment that it's kind of murky, but you've like begun the process, and creating a practice around experimentation and learning is much more important to me than a specific kind of starting point. I say
Yeah.
from my ivory tower egghead desk.
I'll just jump in with one last thought. I totally agree with that, John. Start somewhere. But I was talking to a large global CPG advertiser, one of the biggest in that category, and they have a lot of experience doing experiments, which is not true of a lot of their competitors. I've talked to other household name brands that barely do them at all. But this company, in markets around the world, has done hundreds of experiments in the past few years. And they've come to a point where, to minimize disruption, because they get a lot of pushback when they go into a marketing organization and say, we want to run an experiment, and they've already got their media plan built, and now they got to rip it up, and everybody says it's hard. That's one of the main things that prevents them from doing it, is that logistically, it's interruptive, and I mean, that is the point. It needs to be interruptive. But so their approach is they build that into the plan at the annual planning process, that sometime this year you're going to run an experiment, and build your media plan to accommodate that. And the randomization of markets isn't necessarily going to be apparent to you today, but that in May, you're going to start an experiment. And so it's not going to be interruptive. It's going to be planned. And so I thought that was just showed the fact that they've been doing it long enough to have learned that important lesson.
Maybe I can do that for my New Year's resolution diet, like put it in the plan now so it won't seem so difficult for me come January.
Right.
Well, those are great points, and I will say I think must have been about 15 years ago when did it was still more in the SaaS bid management software business, and I was really exasperated with just looking at what some of the agencies were doing, even when using our platform, because we used to have several big agencies that licensed it out before we pivoted to become an agency, and I just was trying to figure out, like, is it that the people at these agencies are lazy, stupid, or overworked? Right? Because I knew that they knew, or I opined that I think that they knew that they were just using the easy button to buy tonnage and not bother to target, and like not do the math to figure out that a well-targeted audience is, even though it's a little bit more expensive, is a better buy than tonnage, right? And so now we're at this stage, to your point, Rick, that many agencies are still compensated as a percentage of spend. So it seems like that there's a conflict of interest there. But I think what's sort of righted the boat a little bit there is that, to the extent that there are visible KPIs, they can't afford the media unless they optimize it, right? So they have to put effort into optimizing it. Otherwise, the CPMs or CPCs are too high. And so that it's to some extent created a meritocracy, if the CMOs are willing to pay attention to the agencies and who does things better than others, between the better teams and the not so good teams, and research and technology have a place in that. So it's going to be interesting to see, because the platforms want to basically say everything's a black box, just give us your black Amex and we'll take care of everything. And that may be an existential threat to the agencies. Maybe we'll finish on your thoughts on that. Should Meta and Google just have carte blanche to run their own MMMs internally without access to any external data and do their optimization in their silos?
No. They already get most of the money because they have the most convincing dashboards. Not that, I think the evidence scientifically is the strongest, but they've just invested a lot in that narrative. Not to keep harping on this same method of the geo-experiments, but another advantage of it is that you're measuring sales in the general population by media channel. When you're letting Facebook and Meta or whoever media platform measure themselves and their bottom funnel, highly technical companies, they are, as you pointed out, Kevin, already benefiting from the wind in the sails that television and outdoor and other channels have provided, up funnel. But they are cherry picking the people to target in the first place that are shedding signal that they're in, right near the bottom of the chute to purchase. And the point of advertising is not to predict who's going to convert and put an ad in front of them real quick before they do and then claim credit for it, even though that's become the game. The point of advertising is to persuade the people who weren't going to buy to buy. And so when you let those companies measure themselves, even when they do the fairest kind of experiment that they can manage, internally, it's within that subset of a subset of a subset of an audience that is already primed to convert. And when you're the CFO looking at where to put your next dollar, that's not comparable to the TV budget. But if you do the geo experiment and you just hold out half the geographies in America and look at your CRM sales data and say, when we turned off TV, we saw, X effect in the test market was X effect higher than in the control market. And when we did the same thing with search, we saw Y, out of the total addressable audience. And that is a apples to apples comparison that your MMM model wants to ingest and that your CFO wants to understand to make those budget allocations. Because otherwise it's very, 15x ROI, but within the people who are already about to convert in the first place.
Great point. Any final thoughts, John?
I would just echo Rick's no answer and would just say that, for the industry overall will not continue to concentrate power indefinitely in smaller and smaller groups of companies. We know that marketing works. We've done plenty of experiments. We've looked at plenty of data. And so the marketers collectively have a lot of power. Each individual marketer, it's much trickier with some of these large technology players. But yeah, overall, and I say this as an educator, grading your own homework is not the recipe for success.
Gets you a good grade, though.
It does get you a really good grade, and 5 to 10% higher grades every quarter, it looks like.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks so much, guys. I look forward to doing this again as the landscape changes. But you guys have made an excellent point or excellent case on folks investing in the kind of research that will really help their businesses move forward.
Kevin Lee's Power Marketing is available on all your favorite podcast networks. Kevin loves helping businesses excel at marketing. Having marketing challenges? Just like Santa in The Miracle on 34th Street, if Kevin can't help you, he'll know someone who can. Find him on LinkedIn, subscribe, or follow.